everybody. I am so excited to be here today. And let me see if I can get this to go backwards. I jumped the gun. We really are having a lot of success in Massachusetts. And so today is really about, like, from what we see, what's been the most impactful kind of work so that people in other states can understand how to sort of replicate the best of in Massachusetts. So we're just going to cover four main things. How to find funding if you're in the States, how to find funding for passive house incentives. There may be similar options in Canada and other countries as well. Then second, like how to start a pilot program, which Jayne's going to be covering. Customizing educational resources. There's so much great stuff. There is no reason to start all over again. So you definitely want to stand on everybody else's work. And then finally, what I think is incredibly impactful, at bringing up the baseline through energy code, because then it's all just becomes easy after that. So I did want to say quickly, Jayne and I work for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. It is not mass save. People make this mistake all the time. And the only reason I want to explain it is because there's two different funding sources potentially in your state. So we are a state quasi-governmental agency. And so we work for the governor in Massachusetts. We work with the state government. The Mass Save program is a utility-led efficiency program. And so that is funded through a surcharge on everybody's electric and gas that goes into an energy efficiency fund. And so those are two different places, like the utility efficiency programs and the state that might be funding opportunities. And so I just wanted to tease that out before we get started. And quickly, like Shannon was saying, huge acceleration in the multifamily passive house space in Massachusetts. So, you know, that 28 unit one building in 2016-17, end of 2024, we're expecting over 5,000 units to be certified to passive house standard. And with the incentive only, this is what we're projecting, over 10,000 units by 2028. Shannon also mentioned that there's been code changes. About 20% of Massachusetts has opted into the specialized stretch code. So that means starting in 2024, these numbers will be much, much higher than what we have predicted here. So that's a big change pretty fast. And just so you can see sort of what size we're talking about, the incentive program incentivizes 5 units and above buildings that go to passive house, but almost the vast majority of the about 160 projects that are in design or construction right now are in that mid-rise, 4 to 9 stories. I do think because the code changes require anything over 1,200 square feet, 12,000 square feet to be passive house certified, you're going to see a lot more in that low rise over time. And it's also interesting to note that almost 40% have been low income housing tax credit projects. So affordable housing is at the forefront here. You know, some of that is Pennsylvania leading and Massachusetts following. And I also think affordable housing often, because they're mission driven and their owners for the long term, care more about this potentially. So I've been mentioning this incentive that Mass Save, the utility program, has had. Starting in late 2017, they started offering this. And I think this is probably the biggest, most impactful thing that moved the needle. We had passive house as an alternative compliance path in energy code for almost 10 years before this, and you did not see very much of it. You know, yes, in the single family market, and yes, that one multifamily. But once this offering started hitting the street and people hearing about it, it really has led to market transformation in a very quick period of time. And so, like I said, this is the utility run program. Everybody who pays for electric and gas in the state of Massachusetts gets a fee added to their usage, and it goes into this efficiency fund. Every 3 years, the utilities, with the state's oversight, plan out how that money is spent for energy efficiency. So what I love is the simplicity of this offer. $3,000 per unit for every unit that you get passive house certification. 500 of that's at pre-certification, 2,500 of that is when you actually get it certified. but I love the simplicity and predictability of this. An owner, developer, contractor can look immediately and sort of know what to expect, right? It's not an MMBTU per off of a baseline comparison that's very confusing and hard to predict, and people don't even put in their pro formas. And this is like big enough to get people's attention. I also like that they gave upfront design support. So any project over 5 units that's proposed can come in and ask for up to $5,000 of passive house feasibility study money. And so when you're doing that design charrette, say you're doing a lead charrette or something, you can do a deep dive on the energy part of it. So everyone knows what would be different from what you were planning to do to, you know, for code to passive house. Like, what are the major changes? You know that like upfront. And then Mass Save also pays for 75% of the passive house modeling, so WFI or PHPP, to up to 20,000 per building. So some buildings have taken both those things and decided not to proceed. I'll say I think architects are often like, oh wow, air infiltration, thermal bridging. I hadn't thought about that before. So I do think it probably leads to better buildings, but we still see an awful lot of people going for that 3,000. And because passive house is pass or fail, I do like another thing that they have in there, which is if for some reason you don't reach passive house certification, there's a soft landing. You still get the double the new construction incentive for the MMBTU thing. So it's just good program design. I'd highly recommend going for this kind of model. So in your state, one of the places you could look to see if you could get something like this in your state, a lot of utilities have what they call a public benefit charge or a systems benefit charge. Sometimes it would be like statewide, like in Massachusetts, where all the utilities have the same one. Sometimes, like I know in Chicago, the electric utility has it for just a smaller area. That there's going to be an efficiency fund. And remember, these were set up often like 20 years ago because utilities said, hey, it's cheaper for us to invest in efficiency than building a new plant, right? That was the original idea behind this. Is Department of Public Utilities, like in every state, tended to say, oh, that is a much better deal for customers, so let's do this. So most of those programs have a new construction program, and that is what you want to find. You want to find that new construction program, which usually does exist, but probably has this, you know, you get this savings for this MMBTU saved compared to this baseline code, and it's complicated. It's probably not enough money to change anybody's mind. A lot of times people don't even take those because it's too much of a pain. And instead you say, do what Massachusetts is doing. This is Mass Save's transforming the market. And I will say, like, utilities like new construction programs. It's easy for them to measure. It's easy for them to justify these kinds of programs. And there's a paper that Mass EC with Mass Save put together for the ACEEE conference. It speaks utility language on how they made this cost effective, like how this actually worked. And we can drop in the chat a link to that, but that is what you want to print that out and send that to everybody at the utilities and new construction program. So the last thing I will say before I hand it off to Jayne is, I know it can be hard with climate change and buildings, transforming buildings, thinking about you as a person making a difference. But let me tell you, Tim McDonald made a huge difference in Pennsylvania. He and David Salomon got in the low-income housing tax credit. Without them, we wouldn't have this program in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, Hank Keating, who's the president of Passive House Mass, pulled together this coalition. Look at all those climate groups there. Built Environment Plus is like the US GBC chapter. And Nessie puts on an annual conference. You've got the planning agencies, you've got the affordable housing list people. He pulled together this coalition. They were writing emails and letters to every piece of this puzzle in Massachusetts. Without that, it wouldn't be done. But those people, those are single individuals, really completely transformed state policy. So you can do it too. And now we're going to hand it over to Jayne.
Thanks, Bev. So something that you can do to kind of help build momentum in your state and build up to those bigger state incentives or utility incentives that Bev was mentioning is to launch a pilot program. And so that's what Mass CEC did in 2017 with the Passive House Design Challenge. So that was a little bit prior to all those larger utility scale incentives. So this pilot program targeted affordable housing, and the idea was really to just fund a group of projects to help kickstart the market, track incremental costs and lessons learned, and kind of use that information in broader conversations with stakeholders and inform programs, et cetera. So there were 8 affordable housing multifamily buildings that were funded through this, $4,000 per unit. And they were structured in 3 milestone payments, with the last milestone being final certification. But it would allow, that means it allowed like prior, like the first 2 milestones to serve as kind of like a risk mitigation, so that you know, if a building didn't make final certification, which is happening with one of our buildings, they still kind of have the rest of the grant money already, and they've made pre-certification and they're not losing out on all of it. So it kind of helped mitigate risk and get people comfortable with the idea. And out of our 8 buildings, 5 of these are occupied and 3 are still under construction. So a big part of our program was to track the incremental costs for all of these buildings. So we ask them to track incremental costs, mostly through like change orders and things like that. And it helps demonstrate that building to passive house standards isn't as expensive as folks were saying in Massachusetts prior to that. I always hear Bev saying that she was hearing people say like 10% incremental cost to build to passive house standards. And so this helped show like, no, we can do it with, you know, only 2 to 3% on average. Some even lower, some are showing like 1%, 1.4%. That's really pretty low. The higher one here, 4.1, we think is mostly driven by the like more complex roof line that it has. And most of what's driving the incremental costs for these buildings, or the highest incremental costs that we would tend to see, was related to improved ventilation and meeting fresh air requirements and things like that. And so maybe like a slight premium, but also a lot of people are paying attention to indoor air quality these days. And so maybe a slightly easier conversation to have than it used to be. So this pilot and incremental cost tracking kind of really helped demonstrate that it could be built at lower standards and kind of help scale things beyond Mass CEC. So we also required to track energy performance, but those things take time to come in, since not all of our buildings are built yet, or have 1 year of data post occupancy. So we started looking into the energy performance of passive house buildings compared to others, compared to LEED and code. And this chart here shows the energy use intensity, so the energy use per square foot, or KBTU per square foot, of a passive house building in Boston, the Distillery North, compared to LEED and code buildings. I think we used relatively new construction, so I think it was 2011 and post that to compare. And what we see here is that passive house is really performing much better than LEED and code, 62% less than the median. And this came from Boston's energy disclosure data set, which more and more cities and towns have across the country. This is a similar chart, but in Philadelphia for affordable housing buildings. We see kind of the same thing, but maybe a little more drawn out here, since we have more passive house buildings that are hovering like at that 25 median for the energy use intensity. LEED and code here have higher medians. Some of the code ones are lower, but we heard from the people that pulled this data together for us at Green Building United that some of the code ones were aiming for net zero, but really what we see is that there's a lot of variability in the performance of the code and LEED buildings versus the passive house buildings are consistently performing around 25 and really are delivering like the energy performance that is promised by the standard. And the last little chart that we have here comes out of New Hampshire from Resilient Building Group. And this is as apples to apples comparison as you can get in between a LEED and a passive house building or a code and a passive house building. There are two buildings, one built to LEED, one built to passive house standards, built a couple years apart, same builder, same architect, same team, same designers. And this shows the energy performance of the two buildings, I think averaged over a 3-year time span or something like that. And we can see the passive house building is using almost 50% less energy. So where would you get funding for a pilot program? A state energy office similar to Mass CEC or something like that would be the best place. And now is a great time to ask because many of these state energy offices have money from IRA or infrastructure bills, the ARPA funding that they need to spend. A pilot could be around 2 million and they would likely be able to find that somewhere. It's a great way to kind of just demonstrate some things and get something started. But it does take a little bit of time to build the program and, you know, get the data from the buildings once they get built, et cetera. So you might have to wait a few years for the results, but at least Passive House Design Challenge, we had some very good intermediate results already, so it can be very beneficial too. So if you're interested, if you're talking to folks in your local energy office, or if you are the energy office, we're happy to help and talk to them too. We have program documents that we can share. We have lessons learned online. And then the last little thing here, I think, is that Mass CC focused on affordable housing. It doesn't have to be affordable housing. You can target it more broadly or not. But I think multifamily has the best economics, so it might be a little easier to focus on multifamily in the beginning. And I'll pass it back to Bev.
The next area we wanted to hit on is education. This doesn't work if you don't have a lot of educated professionals in your state. And I will say, like Vermont, Enrique Bueno tells me that the Efficiency Vermont offering on an MMBTU basis is not that far off from the $3,000 per unit that Mass Save offers, but they have almost no uptake. And he says it's because, well, first, the offer is not as simple and obvious or even says passive house in it, but also there's just not enough trained professionals in the state. And so New York, NYSERDA actually has done this way longer than Massachusetts, paying for half of the cost of certification for professionals. So there's a lot of online options now through both PHI and FIAS. And a lot of times, you know, regionally you can find something in person as well. But being able to, when you pass that exam, get half the cost back, I think does help people go for it. The other thing that I will say is Passive House Accelerator is one of those fantastic places to find great content. There is no reason, if you are a Passive House Minnesota or something, that you need to redo all the content yourself. You know, Ed May is one of my favorites. He's in the middle here, like that 10 easy ways to mess up a blower door and fixes. Super great. I mean, everybody who's into building science should just listen to that, even if it's not Passive House. He has that deck. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk. The other option that's maybe even easier for him is replay the Passive House Accelerator webinar that's recorded and on YouTube, and have Ed just answer questions in the chat. Like, that's the easiest of all, right? These are a couple of my other favorites: Window Geek's Guide to Installs, Sean, How Not to Put a Pin in It. I'm a big air infiltration person. Passive House Mass also has a lot of really great ones. So Stephen Winters, they put on this great construction workshop. They have an in-person option, but during COVID, they recorded these 3. Actually, there's 4 of them, but these are my favorites. You can see it's really specific to the trades. So if you're working on something, like sending your carpenters who are going to be doing the window install the link to this to listen to, why not, right? Like maybe they won't listen to it, but it's an easy thing and it exists and it's really good. So definitely think about reusing things that already exist. So this idea of reimbursing half the cost for professionals too, I think there's an unprecedented amount of workforce training money at state level agencies right now. So ours is offered through the efficiency program, so was NYSERDA, so Mass Save and NYSERDA provide that. But there's often like an Office of Labor and Workforce on the state level that's going to have a ton of money right now to upskill existing workers because of the IRA. This is the perfect kind of thing to pitch to them. And also just funding like new content for you, or even like repurposing content that already exists. So definitely take a look at Passive House Accelerator, Passive House Mass trainings. And I think New York Building Exchange has a lot of really great ones too, especially in the retrofit space. And so finally, the big last thing that makes life so much easier if you can get this through is bringing the baseline up through energy code. So we just went through a cycle in Massachusetts, and every state is different how they deal with energy code. So I think some states, there's only one energy code for the entire state. And then other states, a community can opt into something that is a little bit more difficult. So a lot of them call it the stretch code. So in Massachusetts, there's 3 options. There's the base code, the stretch code, and now we've created a specialized opt-in net zero code. And that is the one that's requiring Passive House for everything over 12,000 square feet. And 13 communities, about 20% of the population, have already opted into that. But this is the way to go. I am part of a group called Green Newton in my community, Newton, and we've been meeting with developers proposing multifamily and pitching Passive House and the incentive. Probably 20, 25 buildings a year. It's a lot of work. Now they all have to do it. They come to us to say, what are the best trainings, right? It's just a very different conversation. And we can push like embodied carbon or other things that we want instead of just the Passive House. So figure out how code works in your state. And it may take a while, but it's so worth it. So worth it. So finally, I just want to say staying up to date on performance benchmarking and incremental cost data across different regions and states is super important. We're probably generally not doing enough of this measuring, and especially the performance. I think a lot of people have been turned off by lead buildings not actually getting the energy performance expected, and so they think Passive House is going to have the same problem. We need to measure to show people that that's not true. So thanks so much, and back to you, Zach.
I think back to Shannon.
Shannon.
Bev, amazing. Jayne, fantastic. Absolutely love the biggest lessons learned, how to bring the baseline up through code and incentives. I think everyone's ready to move to Massachusetts now. We've got a lot of great questions for you both today, but first we're going to take a quick thank you for our sponsors.
Hi, I'd like to give a big thank you to the fine organizations that make our work at Passive House Accelerator possible. First, a big shout out to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thank you too to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingui Architects, Glavel, Minutair, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And thank you to our champion sponsors, Bewiso, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, Proseco, and Source 2050. And thank you to our patron sponsors, Brennan, Coltraco Ultrasonics, Euroline Windows, Holstrom System, Inotech Windows and Doors, Lamelux, Owens Corning, RDH Building Science, Sanderson Sustainable Design, and US Engineered Wood T-Stud. Thank you, sponsors.
Yes, thank you, sponsors. Everything we do here is funded by our sponsors, so please check them out and get ready for the Q&A portion of today's presentation. I'm going to jump right into it because we want to use every minute we have to learn more from our amazing guests. Our first question up is from Andrew Steingeser. Andrew, did I say your name correctly? And would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, sure. Hello, Andrew Steingeiser, RDH Boston. Hey, Bev. Awesome presentation. I have to look back at my own question, but I was asking something about, the new construction passive house incentive has been hugely successful here. To your knowledge, are there plans for that to continue into the foreseeable future, particularly given the large influx of passive house required projects we're going to see now? Is there funding in place for that program to continue?
Good question. And I think it depends on what the Mass Save utility program evaluators say about what they're getting out of it and not. So I suspect that the communities that are requiring passive house for those multifamily buildings, they won't be able to offer it after this 3-year plan is through. That's what I would guess. However, I'm not totally sure. Like, they might be able to reduce it because they're, it's still new. They haven't completely transformed the market. It's not really, and it certainly should be available the rest of the state, other than the communities that have done the opt-in that requires it. I just think that utility programs, when something becomes code, it becomes hard for them to offer it.
You mentioned a 3-year period. When's that end?
So there are 2 more years left in this 3-year period. And they're in the process of coming up with the next plan. So that's the place to put in comments. So Hank Keating writing those comments in the 3-year plan, I think he had more comments saying we need a passive house offering than any other issue. And that is why the passive house offering is there. But like continuing it, you can do the same thing, right? Say not enough people know what they're doing yet. You need to reward first adopters. It can't be forever, but I think you could get it longer.
Good place for the IRA money. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. And we're going to move straight to Howard Stern. Thank you, Caleb, for reaching out. Is this the real Howard Stern? Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Or I can ask it for you.
You can go ahead and ask it. It is the real one. The other guys are fake.
Fantastic. So Howard asks, the mayor of New York City wants to undercut local law 97 primarily because of what it will cost co-ops and condos. Any advice? Really need long-term data on savings of future energy costs. Any sources for that you can recommend?
Well, I mean, there are, so Bright Power right now is pulling together a study on high performance buildings, including passive house in the Northeast, with an eye towards the operating costs of those compared to others. So if anyone has Northeast examples, and we've already submitted all of ours and connected them with ours that we've been involved with, I think it just takes a while to get that kind of data back. When you still have things under, the first year is always tough. You guys know that. Like, there's things that go wrong and, it's not necessarily representative. But that's one place. I feel like the federal government should have some kind of role here. I've always wondered why we have, FIAS is working with Department of Energy, Zero Energy Ready, which I've got to say, I still have trouble communicating with people what passive house means after all these years, even in Massachusetts, even with all these incentives. And I've always wondered, why can't DOE's Zero Energy Ready, which I think is the best name that it could be, why can't we make that into it's a voluntary program. Why can't we make that into passive house, right? Like, and then the federal government would have more of a role potentially. I don't have great ideas, I've got to say, especially on the state level.
I thought I was muted when I started clapping, Bev, but I feel you there. I completely agree with you. It's a way better name than the old Building America program that preceded the Zero Energy Ready Home, but they're so close. Just go all the way. We can do this. You've proven
And
it.
it's voluntary anyway. And like, I don't know, in Massachusetts, that's like code with, it's really not that great, what the standard is right now. So like, let's make it better. But anyway, yes, future Passive House Accelerator webinar.
Absolutely. All right, our next question up is from T. Boog. I think it's Boog, B-O-U-G. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, it's Teresa Bourgeois. I'm interested in if these all sound like new builds, and I'm wondering if there is a program in Massachusetts for historic restoration. I'm from a community that is working to restore our historic municipal buildings in combination with floating solar. And it's a much different approach, but I'm wondering if you have similar projects, programs there in Massachusetts.
So I would say not yet, but we're getting there. And I would say, so in Massachusetts, 80% of our buildings are still going to be here in 2050, and we have a state goal of getting to net zero. We cannot ignore existing buildings, but I think all of us who know the building science know it's the hardest nut to crack in our climate policy. And so, there's some efforts, especially in the affordable housing space, where we have a little bit more money to look at sort of energy sprung approaches. But I think we're quickly finding that the energy sprung model doesn't work as well here because we just have way too much variety in the building stock. That being said, there are definitely buildings, and especially in the affordable housing and public housing space, that have an envelope that needs recladding because of water issues, structural issues, whatever. So we're going to need an approach that brings down costs that is sort of like energy sprung-ish. But I think the real question is, how do we tighten up the envelope and add ventilation and electrify at a reasonable cost optimized way without, still making residents comfortable or people who are occupants comfortable, but maybe not going all the way. You have to have a different approach. You're going to have to go to the inside on a historic structure, right? Like, and maybe you can't get to the air infiltrations. So like EnerFit and then the Renew program, that's where we don't really know what we're doing to the extent that we need to do this at scale.
Thank you.
Great question, Teresa, and great answer, Bev. We had a quick comment from Kevin Brown asking for the links for the incremental cost data that you guys were going to put in the chat. So I'll give you a minute to do that in the background while we move on to Mo. Hi, Mo. Good to see you. Want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I was just, if I remember correctly, my question was about those incentives, whether they were mainly for new construction or for retrofitting, or both.
Just new construction. It's the new construction program. Like all the stuff we were talking about, a passive house accelerating in Massachusetts, those are all multifamily new construction. And like I said, this is the easy part. We don't have the answer on the retrofit part. We need to get there. And I think the state as a whole is trying. We don't have answers yet. We'd love to hear more from the retrofit space.
Thank you.
But I think we all know it's harder to retrofit our buildings, which is why we have to do it right the first time, right? You don't want anything new going in with anything but passive house now, because to retrofit it in 15, 20 years just doesn't make sense.
100% agree. We should all be like Brussels.
I agree. Our next question up is from Larry Lemenchik. Am I getting that right?
Hello, yes.
Welcome. Would you like to ask your
Hi.
question?
Sure. What did I ask? I was wondering about the if you could share links to those projects that had really low um, increase in construction costs for passive house. I think one
Yeah,
of them was called Kenzie or something like that.
yeah. So if you would, so you can Google this. I'm gonna have Jayne put the link in. She just put it in right now. So that's the webpage for Mass DEC's pilot program for those 8. And if you click on the incremental cost, now Kenzie's not finished. So you would have seen on that slide, like if you go back to it, that we said the 3 that aren't complete yet, there may be change orders that slightly change it, but it's not going to change it more than percent. And I think one of the things we learned is like Kenzie is probably the most experienced team. It's POA, like it's everybody who's done this before. We found the lowest incremental cost with the most experienced teams that had the most education. And the one that failed, it was an architect who said he had everything under control, really never got the education he should have. And I think 400 double hung, double glazed windows and sliders showed it up on site, right? And it was too late.
Yeah.
So the education, I can't, so important for the whole team, even if
Right.
it's the light touch and not a full, even if the architect's not going to get certified passive house consultant, if they watch a number of videos, Lino webinars, like you can learn a lot that way too.
Thank you for sharing the links. So yeah, it looks like all the projects are on here.
Yeah, and that if you keep going down that page, there's the ACEEE paper. That's more like an academic paper, but it's all written up in like academic form, including those graphs on performance and the incremental costs. A
Okay,
few of the
great.
incremental
Thank
costs
you.
might have changed like 1/10% or something, but like it's
No, it'll still
very
be
close.
really interesting to read. Thank you.
Sure. And that's what I said is like in utility speak. If you give that to a utility, they're the ones who go to those ACEEE boondoggle week expensive.
Right. Okay,
So
thank you.
yeah.
Highly technical term, the boondoggle. So that's when the windows show up on site and they're totally different windows than you specified. That's the boondoggle. All right, our next question up is from Jay Murdoch. Jay?
Hey, Shannon, thanks. And thanks to the PHA team. I have too many questions. I'm going to just do one of them, which is my constant challenge. So I have to deal with policymakers. I have 30 seconds to communicate something to them. So Beverly, great storytelling. So I think I've failed at doing the following. I almost need a timeline. I need to do storytelling for Massachusetts journey. And to Brett in Vancouver, this is how Vancouver did it. So that the policymakers can see how they fit in all those things, because every state is different on their legislative and policy journeys. So you can't wag the finger and say, do what Vancouver did. You've got to give them some context. So maybe a future project would be just a simple timeline of this is where we started. This is how long it took us. And then we had epiphany and passive house seemed to be the solution or something like it. And then a companion piece of, don't take 10 years like we took. There's a way to you to collapse this to 3 or 4 or 5 years. So that might be an interesting deliverable and maybe a future webinar of lessons learned from policymakers on how to communicate to policymakers. So thank you for your time.
Great suggestions.
And we definitely need to include Vancouver in that conversation because they have also gone for passive house and are doing a lot of great work there in Vancouver. Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, it was the biggest compliment ever at FIASCon last year when, I don't remember who it was, but said Massachusetts is the new Vancouver. We're like, whoa.
The high praise. Next question's from Greg. Greg, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So we've already been talking about the renovation of existing buildings and historic. That's like super important. But also some of the places in the United States are decarbonizing, going to, trying to get rid of natural gas. And I'm just curious if the people who are not in Massachusetts here are experiencing that and seeing it as an opening towards the work that would make it a passive house, because they align so well together. Not so much.
Absolutely.
wanna
No,
speak
that's
up?
the equation. Go ahead, Bev.
Yeah, and they're complementary messages. Sometimes I worry that sometimes people want to electrify without doing enough to make people comfortable and for heating costs not to get out of control. And our grid's got to handle it too, right? All those three things has to happen, which is why, Passive House does it. And actually, Jay, going back to the storytelling, I still think the health and the better quality building message is underappreciated. So like, to me, the big difference from the general contractors who have been involved in the 8 projects that we did, they said, this isn't that different than what we did. It's just someone was checking us all the way through to make sure we were doing it right. And that construction verification meant we were being watched, and not in a bad way, but we were like noticing all the way along. And we would hit those numbers and we'd all go out for a drink. And like, there was something to celebrate that was measurable, right? Like, that means it's a much better building. I worked in affordable housing. I can't tell you, like at refinance, how many times we thought we were just doing baths and kitchens when we went in, and we found an envelope issue because there weren't enough eyes on the building science. It wasn't built the way it was drawn. And so you had like mold in the insulation or rotting sheathing or something like that. I don't think you're going to have that with Passive House buildings to the same extent, because it's been checked. It's really, you've got to figure out the detail for the air barrier. You're not getting unexpected moisture in between, kind of thing. So I'm sure somebody else can say it better, but I think that part of the message for storytelling needs to be told more.
Yes, we need to continue this story long into our future, until we have this problem solved or until it's code everywhere. Why don't we take a pause right about now, because we're nearing the end of our first hour, and have Kim share some upcoming Passive House events with everybody.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Bev and Jayne, for the presentation. A few events and happenings to share with you. Starting off, our podcast episode this week features Gunther and Marcus Lang, and they are with Lang Consulting out of Austria. Next up, we have a series of interviews that have been recorded at the Passive House Canada conference a few weeks ago, and we have 6 currently available for you to listen to, and about 15 more to come. So be sure to check those out. We are releasing about 1 every day for the next week or so. And we would like to thank Your Align Windows for their underwriting and support to make these possible. Next up, tomorrow we have a special event with Icon Windows and Doors, and they are joining us to talk about how to compare different window and door material options in your next Passive House project. This is 12 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, 9 a.m. Pacific, and there's a link to register in the chat for you. Next up, for our programming in June, we have 10 steps to designing a multifamily passive house with Michelle Apigian from Icon Architecture. She'll be joining us next Wednesday, June 7th at noon Eastern. And the following week, we have Kara Haggerty-Wilson from Onion Flats, and she will be joining our Next Gen series to talk about designing for net zero on an urban site. And next up, we have an event that Bev sent over. Thank you, Bev. This is a free session about carbon leadership, discussing the best available tools for various stages of designs and how to select the appropriate tool for your next project. Again, free session, and link is in the chat to register for that. And finally, just a reminder for those of you who may not be aware, we have a new YouTube channel, Reimagine Buildings, and our most recent video is with Michael Ingui, 10 steps to building your first passive house. So be sure to send that to anyone in your network who might be curious about passive house projects. And also be sure to subscribe. Back over to you, Shannon, for the last few questions.
Thanks, Kim. If you haven't checked out the Imagine Buildings website, it is really, really beautiful. And the new podcasts are fantastic. So, you know, when you're cooking, just pop on a podcast, get a little more education, learn from someone else's experience. and go back and check out some of our previous recordings of Bev too. She's done a number of presentations with us. We've got a few more questions. Our next one up is from Kevin Brown. Kevin, are you still with us?
Sure am, yeah. Yeah, I was somewhat, banging away in the chat, so I'm unsure exactly what question we're talking about. But I did have some comments about heritage buildings, and I spent 20 odd years in the world of heritage, and then took a wild leap of faith into modern construction. Had to quit carrying my hand planes to work, similar to there it is. There's the photograph in the background, and modern construction leading to passive house for the past 10 or so years. And so, but it's crucially important to marry the two. From a Massachusetts point of view, I spent 6 weeks, in 2019 in St. John, New Brunswick, just north. And St. John, for those that do not know, the entire town burned down in 1870. And so they rebuilt it almost immediately, because St. John at the time was this gigantic sailboat construction area. Fully 1/3 of the world's commercial sailing fleet was registered in St. John, New Brunswick. Anyway, so there's lots of stories there, but while I was there, I had a long visit with Jim Bazanson, who's a heritage professional, one of the Canadians that was at forefront of the field. And we went over and over and over, like 6 weeks for me was free brain picking, actually. Some of the criteria that we'd have to develop, and some of the things we'd have to watch out for heritage buildings. And some of that work is nicely being nicely being represented in work that's being done in Europe. But in North America, it's definitely something that needs to be looked at. And I happen to be in Calgary, Alberta right now. So we're a cold climate Canada, and there's far different moisture and freeze thaw gradients and concerns in the east. However, with three wide brick as well as wood, there are techniques available to do it. Thus far, we haven't had a gigantic amount of uptake, because I think everybody's terrified of it. So anyway.
Thanks for those comments, Kevin. I'm sure you're right. A lot of people are afraid of it until they get a good education under their belt and good examples that they can follow. Bev, what do you think? Do you guys find that people are scared and that's why they don't adopt?
Just to hold on, just to quickly add to that, I just popped in the chat. Let me see. The National Trust for Canada, which is involved in heritage restoration here, they have put they're going to have a webinar on low carbon and heritage restoration. So that'd be well worth. So there's lots of confluences, right? Lots of ways to marry the fields. Thanks.
We have a long way to go on existing buildings, and especially ones that are beautiful on the outside, for sure. And I guess I want to put in one last call to action, which is any of you who are experienced in multifamily, we need project managers, we need verifiers in Massachusetts. Like it's going to be off the charts. Come think about working for us. And I put just a few things that I happened to find online real fast from some of the folks who do a lot of work here for job positions. We have a ton of open positions. Yes, we're training up young people, but you need people who know what they're doing too. So think about it.
Yeah, it's a great business plan, and it's work that's just going to keep coming. So, get into the front of your field and join a great crew over there. Like I said, it's time to move to Massachusetts. There's a job waiting for you and a passive house. Speaking of Massachusetts, our next question is from someone in a municipality that has already adopted the highest level of the code. Margaret Reynolds from Cambridge. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Margaret, I think you're still on mute.
Hi. My question that I've posted was about New Hampshire. So I don't believe there is any adoption of passive house in New Hampshire, and that's my question. We're trying to do a retrofit of an old farmhouse that goes back probably to the Revolutionary War, and we just wondered if there was any support, anybody who knows of support or interest in promoting passive house in New Hampshire, and particularly training for builders.
I don't know of anything. So New Hampshire, I've been to conferences there speaking, and they always joke about New Hampshire being the donut hole in the donut of great climate policy and programs. I do know there's some really great nonprofits that are working on changing that, but I think it's been a state that doesn't invest well in efficiency and renewables. But sometimes you just have to get active in politics to change that, right? So,
yes. Bev, do you have any names of nonprofit groups that are doing that? If you do, just put, maybe send me an email or something.
Yeah, I do know of some that work on community solar in particular, and like Heat Smart and Solarize programs. And I don't remember the name of it. Send me an email, Margaret, and I'll find who it is.
Okay, and is there any way a builder can be trained in Massachusetts who's building in New Hampshire?
No, Massachusetts has very generous education stuff if you're incorporated and paying into state unemployment, right? So honestly, any firm under 100 that's paying into state unemployment can get 30,000 of training for their employees per year under the state labor and workforce. So when I was saying that, like, lots of state workforce training, so like that might be a thing. Like there might be an office of workforce training in New Hampshire that has a lot of money for, and it's like multi-purpose as long as it's on a list. And so getting passive house builder on that list.
Yeah.
Like, so that's one way without like changing everything that you might be able to get something quick.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, this is a long-term project, but it's, it just, we're miles away from the Massachusetts border.
Yeah.
A lot.
I know Massachusetts isn't the same as everywhere, but at least it's good to know somebody else is doing it and to be able to point to it, right?
Yeah. Tantalizingly near, and we may be able to organize some kind of at least attendance at courses. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Margaret. Hey, Bev. I just wanted to jump in and say, yeah, New Hampshire is really interesting because all the issues Mass has with housing are moving into New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And without the awareness that Massachusetts has, but we have a responsibility because we know something, so we can't, show up there and forget what we know. And that's been my dilemma. But I am trying to build a passive house multifamily in New Hampshire very early on. But I think it's kind of important to help guide them as well, so they can figure this out, because there's a lot of affordability issues and a major shortage of housing. So I think we should just put our heads together. And Margaret, I emailed you in the chat, so we'll do the conversation.
That project was in Guilford. I was fascinated that they did a multifamily in Guilford.
Yeah.
Do you know where are you working then?
On the seacoast.
Seacoast. Yeah. No, we're up at Lake Winnipesaukee, so it's miles away. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Zena. It's great to see you here. I threw a link in the chat for those of you who don't know Zena. We have a great presentation she did for us on passive house developing. And yeah, I think Hanover, New Hampshire was the first Ready for 100 certified town in America, which is pretty awesome. So New Hampshire is no stranger to efficiency and decarbonization. So it'd be great to see a repeat of Massachusetts go over the line there. All right, we have just a couple questions left. Brian, are you still with us? You were a moment ago. Brian Conwell? If you can't unmute. Oh, it's Cornwell. Excuse me, Brian Cornwell from Alpin. If you can't unmute, I can ask your question for you, which is, what is the best way to get passive house products into the toolkit of mass builders and architects? Well, working for Source 2050, I want to know the answer to that question too, Bev. Jayne, any light you can shed for us here?
I mean, I just think people have to hang out with the passive house community to understand what projects they're using. Besides, of course, like clearinghouses like Source 2050 or 475, like there are definitely places like you can go look at stuff. I think the awareness is more the issue. So like when I was just up at a passive house project in Newburyport, and nobody on the team has had passive house training, and they were complaining about the cost. Of course it's expensive. They're doing a lot of really silly things. If they were hanging out with Passive House Mass on a monthly basis, that community is so generous, telling people what has worked for them and has not worked for them. And so, but they didn't even know Passive House Mass existed. And I'm like, oh no, like we need to add more capacity at Passive House Mass so that we can connect all this great education with, and this great supportive community with people who are doing this for the first time. Because you don't just, if you try on your own without any awareness of anything else, you have to make the mistakes other people have made. And that's, you want to jump over that.
Thank you, Bev. Exactly. That's the whole mission of Source 2050. If you want to get some free advice and services, we offer those to everyone and anyone from newbies to pros. So reach out to me in the chat. I'd be happy to meet with you. Our last question, unless someone throws some more into the chat, is from Jay Murdoch again. Jay, would you like to unmute again?
Oh, sorry, I got two. Thank you so much. So really in response to Bev's comment about, I want to say durability and health and comfort, one other aspect that I could use to deflect on the perceptions of first cost is what are the opportunities for risk mitigation because of durability, warranty, callbacks, and on the operational savings. So that's another thing I'll need to start gathering. It might be out there. Maybe we don't have enough evidence because we don't have enough passive house projects where we can test and monitor. But I think longer term, so that I can go to the lending, like the Sadie McEwens of the world can monetize a passive house project, or the insurance underwriter could monetize a passive house project, or whatever, or even a buy and hold developer could put that in their spreadsheet of economics, long-term operational. So over time, I need to start gathering that information. I have to have evidence because I've got lots of lawyers in my company who make sure I have actual citations. So just an observation and comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish, you know, a lot of these projects, even the ones where we were showing like energy performance data, they don't even have 5 years under the belt, right? So like the durability issue is probably in 10, 15, 20 years. So I don't know that we can measure that really well. However, I think like there's a bunch of stuff on indoor air quality comparing like tight new construction lead, but without the ventilation to passive house right now. There's a DOE study and group in Massachusetts. So I feel like that would be something like, to me, selling that to the health of, you know, for market rate, if you can say you won't be able to smell your neighbors cooking or whatever they're doing next door, and you can't hear the street noise, like, you know, getting people, I don't know how you monetize that exactly, but a lot of the things people hate about multifamily are much better with passive house. They're more comfortable. They don't have that kind of stuff. And then I think the one thing you might be able to monetize is, I've heard anecdotally in New York that a lot of lenders like lending to passive house buildings because the turnover is way lower because tenants are much happier. And that's actually on an operating sheet for running a multifamily building. That's like one of your biggest things that you have to assume fairly high unless you have a better track record. So if we could show much lower, I mean, I think in affordable housing, it's a little trickier because there's usually wait lists for all those units. So you can turn them really fast, but in market rate, it can take a while. And you have to, even in affordable housing, you have to probably repaint and, you know, upgrade a lot of things and clean things up that, you know, it's a month or two off. So like trying to monetize that, I think, is the easiest thing.
Absolutely. I just threw a link in the chat for how to appraise high performing homes and why they can sell for more. And this conversation really reminds me of the keynote at FIAS last year, where there were charts about the value of saving people from heat-related illness and noise-related illness. And those were pretty amazing statistics. So you can reach out to me. I know I've got those somewhere in my files. I'd be happy to share. They might also just be on the Passive House US website. So I think we are done with our questions for today. So if you have a few extra moments, jump onto our website, listen to a podcast, check out all the amazing events that are happening this week. Look at the Passive House Canada podcast. And tomorrow we've got an Icon Windows Spotlight. We've got free sessions from the Built Environment Plus for embodied carbons and a tools overview, and all of our Reimagine buildings videos that are out now. So Bev, thank you so much for joining us today. Jayne, thank you so much for joining us today. Please come back often, and we'd love to hear everything you're doing all the time. So if you haven't met Bev or Jayne, connect with them online.